This is a GCSE biology presentation looking at blood and blood vessels. To get started, blood is made up of four main parts. What you have to do is unscramble the letters to identify the four parts, and then in the diagram at the bottom of the screen, you've got to identify A, B, C, and D as the name of each part of blood. Pause the presentation. When you've tried your best to get the answers, you can restart the presentation and see how you've done. So pause now. The four parts of blood are white blood cells, red blood cells, platelets, and plasma. Now, if you haven't already done so, this would be a good point to pause and try and work out which A, B, C, and D is each of 1, 2, 3, and 4. So you can pause the presentation now, have a go in case you didn't unscramble the words, and when you're ready, restart. So in terms of A, B, C, and D, what you have is A is a white blood cell, B is a red blood cell, C refers to the yellowy liquid, which is the plasma, and D refers to the platelets. And we're going to have a look at their structure and function. In this lesson, we're going to look at the different parts of blood. We're going to talk about the function of each part of the blood and how it's adapted to do its job. And then we're going to look at the different blood vessels, their structure, and explain how their structure is related to their function. On the left-hand side, you're given the four parts of blood. On the right-hand side, you're given four specific functions. You simply have to match up each of the type of blood to its particular function. Pause the presentation, take a few minutes, try and match them up, and then restart when you're ready. Pause now. In terms of functions, white blood cells are involved in the immune system, and they have two main functions. One is to engulf and digest pathogens, and the second one is the production of antibodies. In terms of red blood cells, their function is to transport oxygen around the body. The platelets are involved in blood clotting, and plasma is involved in the transport of all other substances except oxygen. Oxygen is the only one that is not transported inside plasma. Oxygen is transported in the red blood cells, as we've already said, but everything else is carried by plasma. You need to know, as well as the functions, you need to know some of the adaptations of the different parts of the blood. So again, on the left-hand side, you've got the four parts of blood. On the right, you have different statements, and all you have to do is match those statements to the relevant part of blood. Pause the presentation, have a go, and when you're ready, you can restart the presentation. So the white blood cells, well, white blood cells contain a nucleus, and they'll also produce an awful lot of protein very quickly in the form of antibodies. Red blood cells, and this is the one that's most commonly talked about in exams, well, red blood cells have no nucleus to free up space for more oxygen. They contain hemoglobin, and the job of hemoglobin is to hold or bind to the oxygen. And they have what is called a biconcave shape. Now, a biconcave shape is simply if you imagine a disc and you made a thumbprint on either side of the disc and made an indentation, that's what we mean by a biconcave shape. In terms of the platelets, platelets have the ability to stick together and form clots. The reason they can stick together is because of the proteins on the surface, because they're actually bits of cells. So lastly, plasma, and plasma is a solvent which will dissolve a range of substances. Now, when it comes to transporting blood, there are three tubes that blood can move through. Each of those tubes has slightly different structure, and each of the tube structure is dependent on its particular function. You have arteries, veins, and capillaries. Quite often when we talk about them in a particular sequence that they occur in, which is arteries, capillaries, and veins, but you need to be able to identify them and know the description and the adaptations of each one and the sequence of them. You don't have to know the specific layers, so you don't have to know the lining, the elastic, the muscle, etc., but it's there because you're going to find it easier when we go through the adaptations to have a familiarity with the structure of each of the different blood vessels. In terms of the process of circulation, blood leaves the heart, goes through an artery, it then moves through a capillary, and then returns to the heart through a vein. Now we do talk about the heart being a double pump system because the two halves of the heart pump to different regions, but that is covered in the presentation on the heart. For now, you need to know the sequence that blood goes from the heart to an artery, through a capillary, and back to a vein. And we're going to look at each of those blood vessels now. We'll start with the artery. Arteries carry blood away from the heart, and that word away is extremely important because later on you're going to have to name some specific arteries. They have thick muscular walls, they're very strong. They also have thick elastic walls, and these things work together so that the arteries are able to cope with the high pressure of blood traveling through them because they're so close to the heart. We have what is called a lumen, and the lumen is the gap in the middle of the blood vessel that the blood actually moves through. And in an artery, the lumen is actually quite narrow to maintain a high pressure. In terms of veins, veins carry blood into the heart, and again, get that word into and keep repeating it because you're going to find it very useful when it comes to naming the different types of veins connected up to the heart. They have a much thinner muscular wall and elastic walls compared to the artery because they deal with blood under much lower pressure, but they have a much wider lumen. Again, the lumen is the gap that the blood actually flows through. They also contain what are called pocket valves, and pocket valves are little switches that stop the flow of blood going backwards through a vein. So if you imagine blood traveling from your feet back up into your heart, those little pocket valves stop all the way up and stop gravity pulling the blood back down. The last thing we're going to look at is a capillary. Capillary is the link between an artery and a vein. They're often found in networks. They're very rarely found in individual. They're found in big giant networks. The reason they're found in giant networks is because it's the place where exchange of substances will occur. Sometimes it's to remove substances from the blood into the cells. Sometimes it's to take stuff from the cells and put it into the blood, but it's always exchange of surfaces. To maximize the rate at which diffusion occurs, it has a very, very thin, narrow lumen, which means it has a large surface area compared to its volume. It also has walls that are 1 cell thick, which means it has a very short diffusion pathway. Again, these things contribute to a high rate of diffusion or exchange of substances at the capillary. One of the things you may be asked to do in the exam is calculate the rate of blood flow. Well, the rate of blood flow is simply a measure of how much blood is going past per unit of time. Often we measure volume of blood in milliliters and we measure time in minutes, but that's not to say that you couldn't give the rate of flow in different units. It'll depend on the question, and be very careful when going through the question. It may ask you to convert from hours to minutes or minutes to seconds. But in the question, you simply have to find the volume of blood and the amount of time it takes for that volume of blood to go past. And we divide the volume of blood by the time. For example, in the 500 mils of blood every 4 minutes, we take the 500 milliliters and we divide it by the 4 minutes, which gives us a value of 125. Most important is we had to include the units. So the units are the volume per unit of time. In this case, the volume's in milliliters. The unit of time is minutes, so the units become milliliters per minute. And just to finish off, quickly sketch out the diagram on the right hand side with the heart, artery, capillary, vein in order, and then try and link as many different words and terminologies and ideas from this lesson as you possibly can to it.